what extent do we have free will? Why does climate change feel ideological? Will genome data collecting test the limits of surveillance? Is it possible that our intuition has been hacked? This is Through Conversations podcast, where curiosity goes from the human genome to the cosmos. We'll talk with the most brilliant minds that focus on answering all of these questions, and many more. This is Alex Levy. Hope you enjoy the show. Hey everyone, today's episode is with Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson is a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a senior fellow of the Center for European Studies at Harvard. He has written 15 books, including The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook, The House of Rothschild 1 and 2, The Ascent of Money, and The Great Degeneration. We had a very interesting conversation. We touched on many relevant topics, including his thoughts 3 years into Trump's presidency, role of institutions in a techie era, hate speech in the framework of the First Amendment, and his most recent book, The Square and the Tower. Even though this interview was recorded back in March of this year, the conversation is still very relevant for today and gives a lot to reflect on for the future. Please enjoy this edition of Through Conversations with Niall Ferguson. Hey Niall.
Hello, Alex.
How are you? It's great having you here.
Well, thank you. I hope the sound quality is good enough. I can hear you very clearly and there's no echo on my end.
Great. Okay, so let's start off. Last time we had the chance to talk was 3 years ago at Ciudad de las Ideas, Puebla. And you finished your talk about Trump. He was just recently elected as president. And you finished with this striking statement that said what scared you the most was that at least for a couple of years, this all might seem to work. So I want to get to what are you thinking right now? What are your thoughts 3 years into Trump's presidency?
Well, I think in many ways, the people who predicted American tyranny, a constitutional crisis, were wildly wrong. And the Constitution has thus far stood up very much as intended to the risks of a demagogic president. If anything, the striking feature of the presidency is the difficulty that Trump has had in wielding executive authority, the most obvious check being at the midterms, but he's also been checked repeatedly in the courts. And I think most people looking at the political situation right now with the Mueller report impending and the Democrats in control in the House would expect him to be a one-term president. I'm not so sure about that because, as I said back in 2016, some aspects of Trumpism have worked. Economically, the US has benefited from a substantial fiscal stimulus in the form of tax cuts as well as deregulation. And in foreign policy, Trump has achieved at least some success in his challenge through tariffs to China's rise. So from the vantage point of a Republican voter or a right-leaning independent, he's delivered on the economy, and his tougher stance on at least some foreign policy issues has also gone quite well. So I think it's too early to say he's toast in 2020, especially with the Democrats leaning leftwards in at least some ways because of the influence of newly elected representatives like Ocasio-Cortez. So I think American tyranny didn't happen. In some ways, Trump has delivered, at least his base is very satisfied with him. And so this ain't over.
And that brings me to China and your most recent article, Cold War 2.0, which is somewhat striking also, and that brings an awesome point of view. But are we seeing just a relationship between China and the United States, a zero-sum game in the trade tariffs, or are we seeing a collaboration?
I think the surprising feature of Trump's presidency so far is that the push on trade didn't happen until last year. 2017 saw a kind of phony peace with Trump meeting Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago and then in Beijing, and nothing much happened except mood music. But then last year, Trump really surprised the Chinese by imposing tariffs and then ratcheting up the tariffs and continuing the trade war for much longer than the Chinese expected. This has undoubtedly put pressure on their system. It has put pressure on their economy. It has put pressure on Xi Jinping personally, because many Chinese are quite critical of the way in which he has handled Trump. And we don't yet know if this trade war is going to end anytime soon. The probability of another Trump-Xi meeting seems to have gone down because the Chinese are terrified that Trump might do to Xi what he did to Kim Jong-un just a few weeks ago, show up, make nice, but then walk. So I think the key point to make here is that the old US-China relationship, the one I called Chimerica, when they were economically intertwined, has gone, and we are into a new phase of Sino-American relations in which the trade war is taking much longer than the Chinese expected to end, and this is a key point, it has escalated into a tech war, a technology war, not just because of Trump, but also because of a growing sense in the US national security establishment and foreign policy establishment that China is a threat. And even in Silicon Valley, the dreams of access to the Chinese market have largely faded, and the realization has grown that China's technology companies are global rivals to the Silicon Valley tech companies. So the trade war is not over, but more importantly, it's metamorphosed into a much broader conflict between Washington and Beijing on a wide range of issues, from artificial intelligence to 5G networks to traditional military and naval concerns. And that, I think, will be very hard to reverse. We're not yet at Cold War II, but we are on our way to it because the United States has essentially woken up to a whole range of Chinese activities that previously administrations, including Bush and Obama's administrations, tolerated. So there's been a fundamental change in attitude towards China, and it's not just about Trump. This is quite broad-based.
There's so much to break down there, and I want to go to what you're saying about the tech war and what will be the role of the institutions in a techie era. Can we draw the line in the sand between tech and government?
Well, it's hard to draw it in China because, of course, the big technology companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, are fundamentally subordinate to the Chinese Communist Party. In the United States, it's more difficult because there's so obviously political tension between Silicon Valley and the Trump administration. Very few people in Silicon Valley want to have anything to do with Trump. Peter Thiel was a very rare case of a tech investor who endorsed Trump. Almost everybody else in all the major companies either backed Hillary Clinton or after the election, repudiated Trump. So the relationship is a tense one, and it's only getting more tense as in Washington the discussion turns to regulation of big tech. We have candidates now running for the Democratic nomination, such as Elizabeth Warren, who favor breaking up the big technology companies, an argument that had almost no traction 2 years ago. And at the same time, we have conservatives in the Republican Party who believe that Facebook and Google are guilty of censorship and discriminate against conservative figures. So the atmosphere is quite strained. The question, I think, is how far the Trump administration's policy on China is going to divide the tech sector in the United States, because some companies, particularly Apple, but a bunch of others, the ones that make microprocessing chips, for example, will lose out heavily if the trade war escalates into a full-blown tech war, because their business models are trans-Pacific. Apple's whole business model has been designed in California, assembled in China. The big chip producers have China as their number one market. So a Cold War between the US and China is a major problem for those companies. It's less obviously a problem for Google and Facebook, as they've effectively been excluded from the Chinese market and I think are giving up hope of ever being allowed in. So they're much less hurt. And actually, from the point of view of Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, there's a way of playing the Cold War to Facebook's advantage by saying, well, you can't regulate us and break us up and do mean stuff to us, because actually that will only help the Chinese tech companies. You need Facebook to be very big and strong to stand up to the Chinese competition. And Jeff Bezos could say the same at Amazon, and I think the same argument could be made at Google too. So I think there's a division actually of interest between the pure technology platforms that aren't really in hardware, Facebook and Google and Amazon, and the companies like Apple that are partly hardware companies that really have become heavily reliant on the Chinese market, either to manufacture stuff for them or to buy stuff from them.
Yeah, that brings me to your most recent book. You talk about networks and what happens when networks become greedy. And we've seen this with Facebook, we've seen this with tech. My question here is, are we using Facebook, or could we use Facebook in a different way? I mean, it seems as the future of democracy, where it seems that perspectives are colliding instead of collaborating, are just hurting us. So my question here is, what happens with Facebook when it shuts down? Yesterday we saw 14 hours of the Facebook and everything shut it down, Instagram, and everyone was panicking. So what happens with us, with the speech, with civil discourse?
I think there are three major problems that are consequences of the growth of the network platform companies, particularly Facebook and Google. The first problem is that a very large proportion of the public sphere is now dominated by those companies. 80% of news in America is consumed via referral from either Facebook or Google. That's far too much power for any company to wield. Secondly, because the companies make their money from advertising, their incentives are, I think, fundamentally suspect, because the business model requires maximum user engagement and attention. And the best way to get engagement and attention is with clickbait, with fake news, with extreme views. So we have a very dangerous distortion that expresses itself in algorithms that effectively promote polarization and deepened division. The third problem is that because of their incentive to grow at any price, these companies have been extremely vulnerable to manipulation by bad actors, and not just the Russians, though the Russians have attracted the most attention. So we have very powerful companies motivated in ways that promote fake news and extreme views, and highly susceptible to manipulation by bad actors, including foreign powers. This is a terrible combination. And anybody who thinks that it has materially been changed since 2016 has been duped, because very little has changed. And most of what we've heard from the leaders of the network platforms has been effectively a smokescreen. Promises to fix Facebook have, I think, been disingenuous. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the way that these companies operate. And if anything, their power has been more obviously abused in the last 12 months than it was before, because they are now using their terms and conditions, their terms of service, openly to discriminate against content that they, for whatever reason, deem to be hate speech. So we need to do something. We can't leave things as they are. Even if Facebook never crashed, it would be too powerful. The fact that an outage can cause so much disruption only reveals that we've grown excessively dependent on this particular platform. I'm glad to say that I'm not dependent on it, and I didn't notice the outage because I never go to Facebook. But this is a wake-up call. There need to be changes in the regulatory framework, and they need to happen soon, because after all, in a year's time, we'll be well into another presidential election cycle. And I do not like to think what effects we may see in 2020 if we don't make some changes.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. And just noting in your book, Degeneration of Institutions, there's a challenge here, because if we go into Adam Smith's free markets, which in your book says it tends to corrupt, but we go into the complex regulation, how can we get into the middle? I mean, should we see collaboration between government and tech? Should we see government telling and imposing the regulation? Or, I mean, referendums are not a good idea, asking the people their position in here. So what can we do? I mean, we're poising into 2020 elections, as you say, and it will be a great challenge. So how can we prevent conflict regulation, and how can we prevent corruption in free markets?
Well, I think the temptation in Washington, especially amongst Democrats, is very strong, just to say, we need regulation. Please, regulatory authority, agency, whether it's the FCC or someone else, go regulate these companies. And this has been a pattern in Washington that goes back to the 1970s. Congress doesn't really want to do difficult things, so it just gets federal agencies to do them. And there are two problems with this pattern. We've seen it very clearly in the case of the US financial services sector. First of all, you end up with extremely complicated regulation. And secondly, you end up with regulatory capture. The incumbents end up using regulation to keep competition at bay. So this would be the worst way to proceed with the big tech companies. They already have enough quasi-monopoly power, giving them a complex regulatory framework that they would then almost certainly be able to instrumentalize would be a big mistake. So I would favor relatively simple regulatory change that can't be gained. I don't believe there's much hope of breaking these companies up. I think antitrust is probably a doomed venture given the state of US law on competition. But what you can do, and this is what I've recommended in a recent paper for the Hoover Institution, is two things. First, you can effectively impose legal liability on the companies for the content that appears on their platforms. Under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was a mid-1990s measure, they have virtually no liability for the content that they host on their platforms. Now, this was a rule that was devised at a time when many of the big companies didn't exist. It was really a rule for fledgling companies that had no way of monitoring the content that they hosted on their platforms. We're now talking about the biggest companies in the world. In effect, these companies have a publishing role and an editing role that they use more and more, and yet we continue to pretend that they have no publishing role, that they're just technology platforms, and it's not their fault if bad stuff appears on their platforms. Well, that's absurd. That's completely untenable. So I'd say get rid of Section 230 so that these companies actually have to seriously monitor the content that appears on their platforms, or risk legal action from those harmed from content that they host. But at the same time, and this is the second thing you need to do, you have to say there is a quasi-First Amendment free speech right that users enjoy in the United States, and it is not appropriate for such powerful platforms that are in effect the public sphere or public square to do censorship in their terms of use, so that anybody they decide is guilty of hate speech is effectively off the platform, or so buried in the rankings that they might as well be off the platform. So you've got to make them liable for the bad stuff they do, but also you need to make an obligation on them that essentially preserves free speech. That way, the pressures on the big tech companies come from the law courts and from citizens rather than from the bureaucracy in Washington. And I think that's a much superior model and will likely deliver better results.
And my question here is the rise of hate speech. Has civil discourse been affected by such labeling? We've seen so many academics being censored, and that's something really crazy. And what happened with Nicholas Christakis at Yale University, where there were these social justice warriors. How can we prevent what we label as hate speech in the framework of the First Amendment?
Well, the thing about the First Amendment is that we have a very clear body of law, more than a century old, that clarifies what is covered by the First Amendment and what isn't. And we don't need to reinvent that. Americans have been grappling with this problem since at least the time of the First World War, and it was a recurrent feature of the 20th century that there were questions asked about, for example, how far active members of the Communist Party and potentially agents of the Soviet Union should enjoy First Amendment protections. If you go through the law, the basic takeaway is that you can say whatever you like in the United States, as long as you are not advocating harm to specific individuals, because then you are guilty of using your rights of free speech to threaten other citizens, and that's not allowed. So that's easy. Hate speech if you want to use that term, and I actually don't like the term because I think it's become infinitely elastic, but hate speech is very clearly going on Facebook or Twitter and saying, I want to kill Ayaan Ali, who happens to be my wife, but has been threatened with death on social medias as often as probably anybody. That's not legal. And there should be legal consequences for those who make those threats and for the platforms that host those threats if they don't immediately take them down. That's clear. But what is unfortunately, but I think correctly covered by the First Amendment is my going online and saying that I think Islam is not a religion of peace, but is in fact a religion that advocates violence to maintain its integrity as a religious community and treats women as second-class citizens on the basis of Sharia law. I can say that. And anybody who comes along and says that's hate speech, you shouldn't be allowed to say that, doesn't understand the First Amendment and doesn't understand American law. So we have to draw a distinction between threats to individuals that have the potential to lead to harm and the expression of views that you might find offensive, but are entirely protected under the First Amendment. This is a clear distinction. What is completely bizarre to me is that partly under pressure from their own employees, who by and large lean leftwards, and partly under pressure from a mainstream media that leans leftwards, the technology companies have increasingly over the last 2 years expanded the definition of hate speech far beyond the legal norms and created a very opaque system of censorship and downgrading of content that seems pretty clearly to skew against conservatives, because the definition of hate speech is essentially being crafted by people on the left and then applied by the technology companies. That's what needs to stop, because when the technology companies are as powerful as they are and control such a large segment of the public sphere, for them to do censorship in an opaque way on the basis of what they call their community standards, but is actually the terms of service that are really operational here, that poses a profound threat to free speech in America, and it needs to stop.
Yeah, I completely agree. The term hate speech has been as elastic as it gets, and the problem here is that we define what hurts us. So we don't go actually to the First Amendment and read it. We just say, hey, you're hurting me, or what's this, and you're being violent, you know? So I agree that we should actually create just follow the framework that exists.
Right.
But here the I think it gets very slippery, because as you mentioned, it's very subjective, and if the left is mentioning and it's just framing what it's hate speech and what's not, civil discourse becomes affected. And you mentioned it, it's becoming an uncivil quality of discourse. I mean, how can I talk to you about Islam when I hear all of these voices like just about to tell me that I'm about to go into hate speech or trigger warnings and everything, which is pretty bizarre, as you say, because how can we as Americans continue to talk about the issues we have if we cannot just express them? So yeah, it's crazy.
I think part of what concerns me is that a culture which originated on university campuses is now spreading outwards into technology companies and the public sphere more generally. And in this in this culture of hypersensitivity, anybody can claim to be offended by what you say, and then can essentially mobilize a Twitter mob to silence you, to call you a bigot or whatever offensive term they choose. And that is a very intimidating atmosphere for those of us who want to speak our minds. And I detected some years ago a chilling of the atmosphere in university classrooms. This has now spread to being almost a national pathology. And it's very dangerous because people have forgotten that free speech requires thick skins.
Yeah.
That free speech is not just free speech as long as you say nice things. Free speech means that you have the right to say quite unpleasant things, as long as they don't threaten individuals.
Yeah.
And therefore, the hallmark of a free society is that I will defend to the death your right to say something that I disagree with and may even be offended by, because freedom isn't free, and free speech means either have a thick skin or don't tune in.
Yeah.
You are feeling terribly, terribly unsafe, then get off Twitter. Don't read my columns. Don't listen to podcasts with people that scare you, and go into a little padded cell somewhere with your cuddly toys and read the Harry Potter books. That's the deal. And if you want to be in a society that polices speech for you and protects you from things that might upset you, then try North Korea.
Wow. Yeah. And you've accomplished something really, really amazing. You've become mainstream. We've read your books, and it's crazy because you haven't become somewhat political correct. You speak your mind. But the thing is that most of academics and most of intellectuals or historians, when they get into this mainstream, they start to become like the status quo. They say what everyone wants to listen. So it's somewhat you're accomplished, and I'm thankful for that, because we cannot live in a world where we start every time we get the chance to confirm our biases. It's crazy, you know. Where's the dialogue there, you know?
Well, first of all, I think it's not especially brave of me to say what I think. My wife has to be a lot braver, because the Islamic extremists are capable of real violence, whereas the most I've had to put up with has been verbal abuse in social media and the mainstream media. And I was brought up to believe that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And I've been called a great many names over the last few years. That comes with the territory of a free society. I do think that it's become hazardous to be an academic who's seen to be on the right. I don't actually think of myself as a conservative, but I am certainly conservative relative to the median academic. It's hazardous to be in that position, because there are people in academic life who really think that you have no business being at a university if you haven't signed up for the full range of progressive nostrums and principles. And therefore, being an academic who dissents from the progressive orthodoxy is hazardous. Sam Abrams is currently being hounded off the campus at Sarah Lawrence, where he's a tenured professor, because he had the temerity to write an article in the New York Times that observed quite correctly that university administrators tend to be even further to the left than university tenured faculty. There are other cases that come to mind. Indeed, there's a pattern of really quite vicious campaigns against right-leaning academics that are designed to run them off the campus. Even Brett Weinstein, who's not conservative at all, got run off the campus at Evergreen because he wouldn't participate in an obviously racist no whites on the campus day. This is crazy stuff. It's like a parody of the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China, except that in this case, a relative minority of social justice warrior students are aided and abetted by faculty administrators who, for some reason, feel it's their role to empower those students. This is very unhealthy, and it means that anybody who wants to speak their mind and not toe the line runs the risk of being on the receiving end of one of those campaigns. And I have had some experience of that at Stanford. So the only conclusion that I draw from this is that we need to be better organized in resisting these illiberal tendencies. We need to stick together when one of our number is under attack. We need to mobilize moderate students, alumni, donors, trustees, to try to achieve a reformation in higher education, because the universities have become corrupt, dangerously corrupt. They're like the monasteries before the Reformation in Europe. And you need a reformation of universities, not only to restore the fundamental principle of free inquiry, of free speech and free publication, but also to purge the universities of some of the really disgraceful corruption that characterizes their mode of operation. See the recent scandal around bribery and cheating in elite college admissions. So I think that the conclusion is clear. Something is rotten in the state of higher education in the United States, though it's not unique to the United States. And if we believe, as I do, that universities are important institutions which should privilege free thought, and that tenure was designed precisely to ensure that professors could say what they think and write what they believe, then a reformation is urgently needed. Otherwise, we're going to have to just abandon these institutions and start new ones. But that would be very difficult. It would be much, much better if we could reform these institutions before they become, like the monasteries in pre-Reformation Europe, unsalvageable.
Yeah, colleges are indeed an important institution. And it makes me wonder, are these movements empowering people, or are they just creating victim mindsets? Because if we don't toughen up, and I don't mean it in a bad way, I just mean if we cannot have a tough discussion and just go with it, think about it long term. Think about the policy we're going to create. Think about everything that will surround the human interaction. And it's just crazy seeing it long term. What can happen when every time you get the chance to talk your mind, something pops up as dangerous and as threatening. So yeah, I mean, that's crazy. And the thing that you mentioned about the briberies, it's also somewhat staggering, because the ones that decide who enters an elite college are humans. And it is very difficult to be neutral. I mean, everyone has some sort of bias, don't you agree? So throw a little money and you're accepted. I mean, it's crazy. And yeah, it's a weird world we're living in. And yeah, we need some reformation. And I want to go into your book, your most recent book, where you mention that history is hierarchical. and I just wonder how will the future be. And just one more question and follow up. And do you think the leverage right now should be for institutions, for the square, or for the tower?
The square and the tower makes the argument that we can understand the human past in terms of the interplay of networks and hierarchies, or strictly speaking, the interplay between decentralized distributed networks and hierarchical networks, since really all human organizations are networks, whether they're very decentralized or very hierarchical. And the observation is that over the long run, quite hierarchical structures have tended to predominate because an imperative for most of human history is defense, and it's quite hard to organize effective defense with a decentralized network. You need a command structure. Every now and again, technology empowers decentralized networks and weakens hierarchical networks. That happened with the printing press after it began to spread through Europe in the late 15th century, and I think it's happened in our own time because of the internet and the personal computer. The belief that there would be something wonderful about a highly decentralized networked world was common to both the era of the Reformation and our own time. Utopian visions of a flat world in which everybody is connected were widely believed in the last 20 years, and they were also a feature of the early Reformation. Martin Luther thought that the printing press would help create the priesthood of all believers that the Bible talks about. The reality, as I try to show in The Square and the Tower, is that a networked, decentralized networked world is actually highly unstable. It is prone to polarization. It is prone to the spreading of fake news. It is actually quite likely to lead to conflict. It's also highly insecure because decentralized networks are terrible at security. What's different about our time relative to the 16th and 17th century is just the network platforms. There was never such centralization of the printing press as a medium. Actually, printing remains amazingly decentralized as a form of replicating and distributing information. So the network platforms changed the story and made our time unique because with amazing speed, the decentralized distributed network of the World Wide Web became dominated by a few very hierarchical institutions controlled by handfuls of people. I think the message of the book is that the networks become the hierarchy, that the emergent properties of the World Wide Web turned out to be unexpectedly susceptible to centralization. And now what we have to grapple with is a situation quite different from that of the 17th century. It's a situation in which our public sphere in which we exchange and reproduce ideas is dominated by a handful of companies that make money from advertising. This is a new problem, but it's not entirely new because we've seen monopolistic companies dominate other sectors in the past. Standard Oil, Microsoft in the case of software. And therefore, we do need to learn some lessons from the history of managing big dominant corporations. It's just that these lessons are more urgently needed now because dominating the market for data is very different from dominating the market for oil. Ultimately, data are more important than oil, and particularly for the functioning of democracy. So The Square and the Tower is, I think, designed to help people think about the difference between distributed networks and hierarchical networks, and to help people realize that Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple are the new towers. Even although they've talked in the language of networks, they are in fact the new hierarchy.
Wow. That's a great way to end our conversation, Niall. This has been great, and I am really thankful with you because you've allowed everyone to cut through the noise and focus on what's actually happening in the world. from a historical point of view and also from a perspective that is rather counterfactual. And not everyone does this, so thank you. And where can they find you on social media, or where can they find your work?
I am a reluctant participant in Twitter, where if you go, you'll find @nfergus, a fairly regular commentator on the world. I have a Facebook presence, but I make much less use of that for reasons that may have become obvious in this conversation. I have a website, niallferguson.com, where you can find all my journalism and a great many interviews. And it seems to me that that's quite enough social media exposure. I'd still prefer people to go to bookshops and buy my books, or even to libraries, wonderful places that don't sell ads, because in the end I should like to be judged by my books, not by my tweets.
Definitely. I'll add a link in the bio. And also congratulations on your 10-year anniversary on the Ascent of Money. It was a great read.
Thanks.
And hope to talk to you soon.
Bye for now.